Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm Nerd Nook. This can only mean one thing, that we're going to do a little bit of science content that will help you with your gardens. So this is going to be the third in this little series on nutrient cycles and understanding our soil and what goes into it, how that relates to plant growth. And we're moving out of the discussion of mineral nutrients and into a discussion of nutrients that have a gas phase as part of their cycle. There are three of these that we're going to talk about. Remember, sulfur kind of gets an asterisk on this. Yes, it has a gas phase, but at the scale of your garden, we're not going to worry about that fact. So there's three that gas phase is really the important thing, the most important part of understanding how they work. Water, carbon, and nitrogen. And that is in order of complexity. Water cycle is the simplest, followed by carbon, followed by nitrogen. So I'm going to go over them in that order. In this video, we're going to do water and carbon. And then nitrogen is going to get its own video. And that's going to be a long one because nitrogen has a lot of fascinating chemistry. And you really need to understand it to understand what's going on in your compost pile, what's going on at the bottom of your goldfish pond, and what's going on in your soil. And that's a spoiler, they are all interrelated. So, water. We will jump into water. There aren't a whole lot of definitions, but there is one that I do want to discuss with water, and that is called orographic precipitation. Or orographic rainfall. Okay? And this has to do with the interaction between moisture in the atmosphere and mountain ranges altering how much precipitation falls in certain regions. So this is going to be the impact of mountains on precipitation, the impact of topography in general on precipitation. So, let's talk about this. We have an ocean, we have a continent, and then we have a mountain range. Okay? So, the majority of evaporation worldwide comes from the oceans. Okay. Okay, my blue marker is apparently dying. Sorry about that. Okay. So we have evaporation coming up from the oceans, producing water in its gaseous form. That little G in parentheses means that I'm talking about the gaseous form of water. Okay? Now, we have water in the atmosphere. In order to form clouds, that water has to condense into droplets. Can you see the board? I'm not standing in the way too much? Okay, good.
You're fine.
Tell me if I stand in the way of the board. The water has to condense into droplets. In order for the water to condense into droplets, it has to have a condensation nucleus. So every water droplet has had something which allowed the free water vapor to condense into a liquid droplet. Okay, most of the time that's an aerosol. And these are volcanic, these are smoke out of smokestacks, this is smoke from wildfires, this is salt spray from the oceans. Any aerosolized solid can be a condensation nucleus. The second way we can get condensation occur is radiation from space coming in. So actually cosmic rays coming in from space do contribute significantly to cloud formation. So we have a condensation nucleus. Store that in your brain for a second because we're going to come back to that thought here in a bit. And this water condenses in clouds. We'll draw a happy little puffy cloud. But now that's a liquid again because it is condensed. Okay? Now this is going to blow over the continent and get pushed up over the mountain. And when it cools, when the air cools, it's less able to carry water, so the water condenses as rain. Okay? Now, the majority of evaporation happens over the oceans because the majority of the Earth is covered in oceans. It's just acreage of what exists, just that simple. But a slight disproportionate amount of rain occurs over land because land has topography. Topography has orographic rain. Okay? So we have extra evaporation over the oceans and extra precipitation over land because we have mountains in our landscape. Okay? If you look at really flat places on Earth, they tend to be dry. Look at Australia. Australia is topographically the flattest continent, and the majority of it is dry. It lacks the orographic rainfall that the rest of the continents have. Okay? Look at islands in large oceans. Look at Hawaii. The flat islands are primarily desert. The tall islands have rainforests on them. The difference is the orographic rainfall effect. So this orographic rainfall, this is what gives us our lakes and our rivers on land and the majority of our water budget on land. Okay. Now in the back, we have a rain shadow. Okay. So the windward slope of your mountain is going to be wet, and the leeward side of your mountain is going to be dry. So if you look at this, right, the west coast of North America, the prevailing wind is from west toward the east. The west coast is wet. Then we have deserts behind the mountains, and then all of the water that evaporated in those deserts starts to fall around, the Mississippi and that kind of region, and then hits the Appalachians and you're wet again. That's this effect. Okay? So understanding this, first little take-home point of this, understanding this is going to give you clues as to what habitat is going to be like on any continent. You can look at a map, you can look at the prevailing wind, and you can look at the way the mountains run, and you can know something about relative climate in this or that area, relative to the water cycle. Okay? Now, the next thing the water does is run off. We can have surface runoff, and we can have runoff through the ground. The runoff through the ground can be percolation through the soil layers, or it can be infiltration down into an aquifer and then movement through the aquifer. Right? When you look at springs, a spring is a place where the aquifer comes to the surface and then is allowed to run off further. Runoff across the surface is fast. Runoff through the ground or aquifer is slow. Okay? We want this, we don't want that. Okay? Now, so far, nothing we've talked about is anything that you have direct control over. Right? But here you do. Again, take home points. This is where you start to be able to do something at the scale of your land to impact the hydrology. The more we can get slow runoff through the ground layers, the more water is available for your plants to grow. Okay? We will do an entire video just on that. Okay, there's a lot to this. Okay? But the concept here is the first point of direct applicability to your garden. Okay? Mm-hmm. You can't change where the mountains are, sorry. But you can change how the water interacts with the ground. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is what happens to the water cycle when we get a forest. Okay? Well, trees do a couple of really interesting things that modifies local rainfall and water availability. Okay? The first is, remember I said, store in your idea that this water has to condense around a condensation nucleus. Well, trees produce a lot of volatile compounds, which contribute to the aerosols in the atmosphere and create condensation nuclei. So if you take a given landmass that's forested, it will have more rainfall than a similar landmass that is unforested, all other things being equal. Trees actually contribute to the generation of rain clouds, which is really interesting. So if you live in a dry climate area and you can plant enough of that area in forest, you will literally increase the rainfall in that area. Now, planting a tree won't do it. This is a bulk impact of large scale land management. Okay? But it does work. Okay? There have been case studies where this does work. Take a completely deforested, dry region, completely reforest it, you will have measurable changes in precipitation. The second thing is that coming off of the ocean, you have a lot of mist, okay, and even inland areas as well. There is water in the atmosphere that has not yet condensed to form a full rain cloud. That water can directly condense on the leaves of your trees, directly from the dew, and either be absorbed directly by the vegetation in the canopy, or drip down to the ground. Okay? This is particularly important in dry coastal regions. The redwood forest, this direct condensation of water onto tree foliage is extremely important to the ecology of the redwood forest. Okay? Dry coastal areas, dry Mediterranean climate regions, this is extremely important. Okay? And the taller the vegetation, the more water it can condense from the dew. So this can be a very important direct contribution to its immediate environment. And this happens at a much smaller scale than the trees contributing to rainfall. So even if you only have a few acres and you're in some sort of dry chaparral or dry-ish climate, planting tall woody vegetation will increase the water budget on your land due to this dew dripping. I have felt this many times in even here in the mid-Atlantic region. Walking through on a really hot, humid day, just, parching, drying kind of day, walking through a coniferous forest, you can start to feel droplets of water splashing against your face from time to time. That's condensation from the pine needles. Usually don't feel it in hardwood forests because they're not pointy and don't drip as easy. But you can feel this walking through a pine forest on a hot, humid day. And it does contribute significantly to the ecology of that area on the small scale. So we have big scale, not influenceable by human hands. Medium scale, influenceable by human hands, but you need quite a lot of land to manage it. And then the small scale impact. Okay, so there's where you get some of your direct impacts. So this is kind of the idea of a gas phase cycle. We have the liquid phase water directly interacting with the plants, running off, evaporating to a gas phase, and then returning. Okay? Water is the simplest gas phase cycle. Let's get a clean board here. Now, carbon. Carbon cycle is one that everybody wants to talk about. Right? Carbon and global warming, a very important topic these days. So we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. Some of this is, again, just like the water cycle, some of this is very large scale and not something you have immediate control over. Some of this is small scale and does immediately contribute to your garden. So, definition. Carbon fixation Carbon fixation refers to plants using photosynthesis to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and convert it to sugars, which can be used by life. Okay? So the simplified, quick to write definition is plants converting CO2 to sugar. Okay? That's what we mean by carbon fixation. And a synonym for this is primary productivity. Okay? Primary productivity. So when ecologists talk about the primary productivity of some ecosystem, they're saying how much CO2 can that ecosystem convert to sugar per unit time and unit area. Okay? How many tons of sugar can be produced per year per hectare, usually are the terms, or kilograms or whatever. So that is primary productivity. Usually we measure that from space by the fluorescence of chlorophyll, which we can measure with satellites. So you can directly measure how much chlorophyll is existing in a given hectare of space by a very particular fluorescent signal that we can measure with satellites. Okay? So this is primary productivity. And this is the base of the food pyramid, right? So everything in life starts with a plant fixing carbon. This is absolutely critical to any agricultural endeavor, from the smallest garden to broadacre grazing, grazing agriculture. Okay? So the chemistry of this is CO2 plus water plus light being converted to sugars, okay? And a byproduct of oxygen, okay? And you could go ahead and balance this if you're feeling particularly nerdy today. I'm not going to dive that deep into the chemistry, right? It's 6, 6, and 3, if you just want to know, right? So 6 CO2, 6 waters produce 1 sugar and 3 oxygens, okay? If you want to go down there. This is gardening, not chemistry class. So we'll just do enough to get to our garden. But that's the general outlay, okay? Carbon dioxide and water, these are low energy molecules, so you have to put energy in to get the high energy molecules, okay? Now, combustion is just the opposite. You take the sugar and the oxygen, you burn it, you get energy out, and you regenerate your 2 low energy molecules, okay? This is reduction. Combustion is the oxidation side of that, okay? Now, here we don't have to draw a whole landscape. You go back to black marker. Okay, we'll just draw a tree, and we'll draw a little grass. Okay? Now, at this tree, you're doing photosynthesis. Okay? So we are losing carbon from the atmosphere. This tree is sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and using it to make sugars, and then using those sugars to make wood and leaves and its own energy supplies, okay, and going about the business of being a tree, okay? Now fall comes around and we have leaf fall. Okay? So those leaves are going to build up in a duff layer and produce humus. Okay? So carbon that was in the atmosphere became the leaves of this tree. those leaves fell, and now they're producing humus. Now, this humus will then oxidize, which is, like I said, combustion, fire is just rapid oxidation, but this will happen naturally in the soil at a slow rate. Okay? So this is your sugar. Reverting, the sugar reacting with the oxygen to revert to CO2 and water and releasing energy in the form of heat. This happens fast in a forest fire and slow all the time through interactions between this humus layer and the oxygen from the air. Okay? And then this CO2 can be refixed, hence cycle. Okay? In a temperate ecosystem, this reaches an equilibrium in about 200 to 500 years. Okay? In a natural ecosystem. So a healthy natural ecosystem, this could be a steppe land, grassland, this could be a forest. But in a natural ecosystem, you will accumulate humus for 200 to 500 years, at which point oxidation is equal to fixation and no additional carbon is stripped from the atmosphere. It will just go through this cycle at a constant rate. Now, as you move more and more tropical and the ground is less frozen less of the year, this time frame shortens and you can store less overall carbon. As you go more temperate and colder, this time frame lengthens until you get to tundra with permafrost, which only ever stores carbon, it never re-releases it until you melt it. Right? Which is what's happening now and why we're getting gigantic methane blows in Arctic regions. Okay? That's, this going from, never reaching an equilibrium to now an environment where it has an equilibrium point and it has far exceeded that, so it oxidizes very rapidly. Okay? So this is variable based on climate. But that's the general cycle in and of itself in the absence of animals. Okay? We put animals in here. We'll go for our little stick figure smiley sheep. Okay? And he's going to eat some grass, and then he's going to release some methane. Okay? Methane is CH4. Now, methane will then oxidize just like the sugars will, and return to CO2. Okay? So we have a little bit of extra complexity because instead of this turning into humus and entering this equilibrium, it's immediately returned to a gaseous form. Okay. That's the basic crux of this cycle. Now, again, applications. How does this relate to your garden? Well, what we want to do is we want to fix carbon as humus and keep as much carbon in the soil as possible. Okay? Now, remember too that these things have roots. We can't change the physics of the carbon cycle. What we can do is alter how deep the carbon goes in the soil by how we're managing our systems. Okay? The closer it is to the surface, the faster it oxidizes, and the more you push this equilibrium point into a low time period. We want we want it to take as long as possible to reach equilibrium so we can store as much carbon in the soil as humanly possible. That's the goal. So activities like shoveling, plowing, turning soil, things like that, mowing is a big one, accelerate this oxidation process, and we reach equilibrium at a very short period of time to functionally no time at all. Like a lawn basically has no carbon storage potential. A garden that is managed no-till has a high carbon storage potential, and a natural forest has the highest carbon storage potential. Okay? So we want to shift that gradient as far toward long equilibrium time as possible, given what we need to do with the land. Okay? I'm not saying everything has to be forest, but we want to take whatever we need to do with our land and engineer things so that we shift this equilibrium point as far in the future as possible so we can store as much carbon as we can. Okay? So that's the first take home. We do that by managing roots. Now, plants have two kinds of roots, perennial roots and annual roots. Even perennial plants like trees still produce annual roots that will grow and die every year. It is only the young, tender, actively growing feeder roots that are active in gathering nutrients for the plant and transporting it up the stem. Whenever we prune a plant, it wants to maintain a certain root-to-shoot balance. It needs enough leaf matter to fix carbon and feed sugars to those roots. And it needs enough roots to gather water and push it up to the leaves to fix carbon. So those have to be in balance. If you prune the top, the tree will then abort some of these annual roots and grow new ones. Not the permanent woody roots, just the growing tips. Okay, it'll abort back to what it can feed, and then as it grows more leaf matter, it will grow out again. Same is true for grasses. Okay? When this sheep eats that grass, it's going to abort those roots, a percentage of those roots, and then as it grows, regrow new ones. Okay? So red is actively growing. Black is now deep in the soil forming humus that is out of contact with the oxygen and therefore cannot oxidize. So this is the double-edged sword of animal husbandry. Yes, Mr. Sheep is producing some stinky methane. True facts. And people like to come and criticize animal husbandry and say this is a big CO2, this is a big greenhouse gas producer because look at how many tons of methane they're producing. Okay, that's true. But where that is, and that is carbon going into the atmosphere. But where is that carbon coming from? Well, a month ago it was also in the atmosphere. So on a 1 month to like on a 1 to 3 month time frame, this methane is actually carbon neutral. Because the plant stripped it out of the atmosphere with this chemistry, and then the sheep, or more accurately bacteria inside the sheep, turned it into methane with different chemistry. I didn't write that on the board. Okay? So on the scale of one growing season, these sheep farts are carbon neutral. Now, some will say, yes, 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 Adam, but methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. True, also true. However, it is a short residence time in the atmosphere, only a decade or two at most before it fully oxidizes back to CO2. So again, if we blow that out, like take the most pessimistic view possible, it's still carbon neutral on a 20 to 40 year time frame. Okay? So not that big of a deal, as long as the sheep ate grass growing naturally in a paddock. Now, as soon as we start using petroleum to move feed long distances, the petroleum burned in the process of doing that is no longer carbon neutral. But that's a question of burning petroleum, not the biology of a sheep. Okay? So, again, getting your materials to feed your livestock locally is what will allow this to stay a carbon neutral enterprise. Okay? So that's the third take home from this is animal husbandry is potentially carbon neutral to carbon negative because the sheet is helping store carbon deep in the soil, which can counterbalance his flatulence if you're designing agriculture intelligently. Okay? So that's the last take-home point of this. Now, that's 2 cycles. That's a whole bunch of information. I'm going to cut this video off at this point, and the next one will relate to nitrogen, which is the most important for your garden of all of these chemical cycles. Well, that and water are the 2 most important for your immediate garden of all of these this gas phase information. So we're going to do that cycle well, and we're going to take an entire video just from that. So I will see you in that one.